Okay, let's wrap up chapter 2, and we're going to be looking at this great theme once again that Paul is trying to present, the gospel message, which is that we are justified by faith. In verse 15, he says it like this: "We ourselves are Jews by birth and not Gentile sinners." Remember that word, Gentile sinners. We'll get back to that in a minute. Verse 16, "Yet we know that a person is not justified by works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. So we also have believed in Jesus Christ in order to be justified by faith in Christ and not by works of the law, because by works of the law no one will be justified." So that's kind of a summary statement that he makes right there, and we'll summarize it even more concisely right here. Every true believer is justified, which means to be made righteous in God's sight or to be declared righteous. We're justified by faith, not by works. In other words, it's not after you do a bunch of good works and carry out exactly what you think God wants you to do that God finally says, "Yep, you're righteous in my eyes. Finally, you've reached the level of righteousness that's sufficient for me." But instead, it's by putting our faith in Jesus Christ that we are justified or made righteous. And again, if you struggle with this idea, go to lesson 1 in our Foundations series and make sure you go through that lesson. It's critically important to understand this is the most basic truth of the teachings of the Bible. But let's go on to verse 17, because this one can be a little confusing. He says this: "But if in our endeavor to be justified in Christ, we too were found to be sinners, is Christ then a servant of sin? Certainly not." Now, this one's a little bit tricky to understand, especially in the ESV, which we're reading right here. But if you go to the NIV, it makes it a little bit clear. Let's go there. It says in verse 17, "But if in seeking to be justified in Christ, we Jews find ourselves also among the sinners." Remember in verse 15, who are the sinners? Sinful Gentiles. So he's saying if we Jews find ourselves to be among the Gentiles who are sinners, doesn't that mean that Christ promotes sin? I'll even put it in my own words to hopefully make it even clearer. If we Jewish Christians associate with Gentiles, don't we lower ourselves to the level of sinners? Now, he's making an argument that he thinks Jewish Christians will be making, which is, isn't there just a difference between Jews and Gentiles? I mean, if we lower ourselves to them, aren't we just sinners then? In other words, they're missing the whole point. They're missing what this is about, that through Jesus Christ, that dividing line is gone, that every person is at the same footing at the foot of the cross, that every person is justified not at all, not one bit by works, but rather by faith, 100% by faith. Now he goes on in verse 18 and he says, "For if I rebuild what I tore down, I prove myself to be a transgressor." Again, this one can be a little bit confusing, so let me explain it. The thing that Paul says he tore down is the law. And he's saying this, that if I rebuild what I tore down, if I go back to the law, if I go back to trying to be justified by my good works, the irony is I prove myself to be a sinner. Let me summarize that. The irony is we'll actually be sinners if we go back to the law. So he throws the comment from verse 17 even further in the face of the Judaizers who would say that if we associate with Gentiles, we'll be sinners. And he says, no, actually, the opposite is true. If you don't, or in other words, if you go back to the law, if you depend on the law to save you, then you'll be sinners because the law can't save you. And then he goes on, verses 19 through 20. I just love these verses. Let's read these. He says, "For through the law, I died to the law so that I might live to God." And then he says, "I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me." He's throwing away his Jewish pride. And he says, I've been crucified. What a humiliating thing that was for Christ. And Paul is putting himself on the cross. He says, I've been humiliated. I've humbled myself with Christ. And he says, it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. I don't depend on my own good works, but I depend on Christ who lives in me. And he says, and the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, not by works, but by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. And let's go ahead and end with this last verse. He says, I do not nullify the grace of God, for if righteousness were through the law, then Christ died for no purpose. Let me put a summary on that last verse for us. If you depend on law, you nullify grace. If you say, I am going to get to God by law, then you can't get to God by grace. See, it's you either can go all in on law and hope you're good enough to fulfill the righteous requirements of the law, or you go all in on grace. There's no half and half. You're all in one or the other. And remember, we learned earlier, salvation equals faith or grace plus nothing. That's the only formula that works. Now, why don't you take some time before you wrap up chapter 2, answer some of these questions together, and we'll see you in the next chapter.